Hi, I'm Rob Cosman. Welcome to my shop. The single biggest problem students have is sawing to a line. I'm going to give you some tips on improving that so that you'll be able to join right from the saw cut to saw cut. Stay with me. So what are we trying to do? Well, you lay out your dovetail, you come in with your saw. If you can saw right to the line, now that's assuming that your lines are in the right spot. I always tell folks, make sure you use a square and you do it precisely because your saw is intended to follow the line. Line's got to be in the right spot. If you can come in there and make those saw cuts exactly where you want them, you can saw out your tails, remove the waste, mark and saw the pins, and assemble the joint. No test fit, no pairing. I can't believe how many people still write articles and they'll advise the reader to saw away from the line, somewhere over here in the waist, make your cut, and then get out your chisel and spend the next hour pairing back to the line. That's crazy. Alan Peters taught me. You make the mark, you saw cut, you mark the second piece, you saw cut, you put glue on it, and it goes together. It's that simple. Now, yeah, I've been doing it a while, and this is something that apprentices would have practiced for a long time to get good at. But we've got tools today and techniques, benefiting from all those people in the past, that enable my students in the first day to be able to pull off what I had taken years to be able to produce. So I'm going to start. I'm going to go through each one of these, and if you pay attention and practice a little bit with good tools, there's no reason why you can't get to that same point. Saw cut to saw cut joinery. Forget about the pairing. Let's get started. Number one, and this is the most critical, starting the cut. If you can't start the cut in the right spot, then it doesn't matter how fast or slow it cuts, you're going to have to pair the rest of it off anyway. So you've got to be able to go in there with precision and start that saw curve exactly where you want it. Problem that people run into is they typically have a saw somewhere around 15 teeth per inch, which is nice and fast cutting for a dovetail saw. The problem is that those teeth have a tendency to grab in the wood. So they're sitting here in position, and because it requires a fair bit to get it going, they push, they push, they push. When they finally get it to cut, it's crossed their line and they've lost that control. Well, let me show you how you can do this with that type of saw, but let me first show you my solution. We built a saw that has the first 2 inches, little tiny teeth, 22 per inch, with a relaxed cutting face, meaning instead of the cutting angle being 0 degrees, it's bent back, 25, 30 degrees, which means that there's very little resistance. So here's what you do. Pinch the wood. You have to create an anchor point with your opposite thumb and finger so that you have something to rest your saw against. I always pinch with the bottom quarter of each digit so that the bump created by the end of the finger and the end of the thumb, when the saw is pressed against them, it's up above the set of the teeth. Each of these teeth are sticking out to either one side or the other, and you don't want to cut your finger. So as long as you're touching up here somewhere, you're okay. So that's a good solid anchor back here. I then press the saw lightly against those fingers, and by always pressing lightly this way, when I start sawing, the saw will not skip and go to my right. And because I've anchored with my thumb and my index finger, it can't go to the left. So I use that, kind of a tug-of-war match here between me pushing and my thumb and finger, and I get in position so that the saw is right beside the line, no wood in between. If there's wood in between, now you're having to guess the gap between the saw and the line. But if you move it over so that there's just line, you can tell if you're slightly over or if you're entirely over. All I see is red pen mark. Because I have little teeth up front, I can start the process with little to no resistance, and then once I get going, meaning enough of a groove that you can catch your thumbnail in it, you move to the back teeth and away you go. By the way, I'm working on a piece of poplar, which is medium density wood, good practice wood. Pine's even easier because it allows you to get your technique down before you have to worry about adding the extra muscle. Now, if you don't have a saw with little tiny teeth, what you have to do is you have to take most of the weight off of the wood. So you cannot apply any downward pressure. If you do, you're going to have those big teeth wanting to bite into that wood. So by taking most of the weight off, in other words, actually literally lifting or taking 80% of the weight of the saw, still pressing against my index finger and thumb, still applying that lateral pressure, just barely touch. Again, the idea is to get a good curve started. Once you've got that, then you should be able to allow the weight of the saw to finish that cut for you. Now, one more tip. I noticed this one time when I was working with a student. I was sitting off to the side, and he had the saw tipped up like this. Well, when you're tipping your saw up like this, you'll have 1 or 2 teeth engaged in the wood, all the way to the saw on 1 or 2 teeth. A lot of pressure. If you lay your saw so that it is level with the top of the board, you now spread the weight of the saw over, in this case, maybe 12 teeth, much less pressure on each tooth, and it really makes it easy to get that saw started, and then you can continue with the big teeth in the back, and away you go. Starting it accurately is the #1 challenge. I have my students make multiple cuts. Don't even go more than 1/8 of an inch deep. Just practice starting. You've got to be able to come in and literally start that saw where you want it without even thinking about it. When you're setting your saw down, getting ready to make that cut, you cannot be out here. If you're way far from the line, you have to judge distance. You have to judge, is this gap between the line and the saw the same as this gap between the line and the saw? But if you move it over so that there's nothing but ink on the right side of the blade, much easier to determine, is that saw parallel to the line? You can tell if you're crossing it a little bit. You can tell if you're over top of it. You want to see all of the line, but you don't want to see any wood on the left side of the line, or if you're doing the other way, on the right side of the line. Idea is to get the saw perfectly parallel to that line so that when you make the cut, you're where you want to be. Ian Kirby once said that if you can see the line, you can cut to the line. There's a lot packed into that, so let me explain. People often ask, why do you use a pen instead of a pencil? Well, the problem with a pencil is that it's going to change its width as it dulls. And if you look at it, it's just not always as precise as a pen. The pen has the same width all the time, doesn't change, and it's so much clearer and easier to see. Now, I typically will use a pen that's going to show up best on that color of wood. So if I'm working on a dark wood, I find a red pen works better. On a light wood, you can use either red or black, whatever. I think you want to avoid these roller balls. The problem with them, although they give you a nice clean line, they have a tendency to bleed down into the wood, and sometimes you have to plane quite a bit in order to get rid of them. Now the next thing is keeping the sawdust off of the cut. So when you first start, you're going to instantly start dumping sawdust onto that line before you've gotten down in there deep enough that the kerf is controlling the cut. At this stage, and I'm amazed how often I'm standing right beside a student coaching them. They've got enough sawdust on there, they can no longer see their line, but they're not established yet. And I'm thinking, how can you continue if you cannot see your line? You always have to be clearing the sawdust until you get far enough down that the kerf is going to take over and control the cut for you. But in those early stages, keep that line highly visible and make sure when you lay it out, I said this earlier as well, that the line is as precise as you want your cut to be. Notice that when I do this, I always aim the pen in like this instead of up like this, where the gauge is hitting somewhere up here beyond the actual ball point. So I hold it like that on an angle, and then I know that that line is going to end up being parallel to my gauge, exactly where I want it. Now here's another one, and this is going to take a little bit of getting used to, because you're having to contort your body a little bit, but you've got to this is where practice really kicks in, so that every time you pick up the saw, this becomes natural. I'll have students starting, and they're like this. Elbows out here, saws over here. There is no straight line, and they're trying to make a nice straight cut while they're hinging their elbow off to the side. So what you need to do is have a straight line that starts here, goes to your wrist, goes to your elbow, and your elbow drops right underneath your shoulder. That causes you to take your body and just tilt it a little bit to the side so that that elbow will hang under your shoulder. Now, that means your feet need to be fairly widely spaced. I always have mine on a bit of an angle. I'm not standing back like this, nor am I starting square on. I'm back here. This rear foot is on a bit of an angle so that when I set my saw down, it's going to set and it's going to be parallel to the line. Now, hey, if you like this video, we have more. Our newsletter has subscriber-only content, monthly discount on tools, and anything we bring out that's new, subscribers get first crack at it. Click on the link below. Let's get back to work. Now, once you've figured out this nice straight sawing line, then what you have to pay attention to is something I call your natural sawing groove. And that means when I come and I'm going to cut that line and I set my saw down like this, if the saw does not fall parallel to the line, if I try to correct with my body, I start sawing, I'm going to go back to where it wants to be. So what I need to do is take my feet and correct by swinging my body around until when I'm holding that saw in that natural sawing groove, it is parallel to the line. I'm getting ready to make a saw cut. My feet are moving a little bit this way, that way, until I finally get that exactly where I want it. Really important that you pay attention to the posture, and at this point I'll also throw in you want a nice light grip. Until you get this all figured out, folks have a tendency to overstrain out here, and that's going to result in not a good cut. You've got to learn to relax this, get this nice and straight, and then be able to operate that like a piston on an old locomotive with a nice straight forward and back stroke that just becomes very natural. That again, that will require some practice. I'm not sure where this term came from, but I'm told this is called a first-class cut. When you cut your dovetails, you're going to have to cut across the grain on the two outside edges to create the little spot where your half pin goes. So I always encourage my students, and by the way, you want a good sharp marking gauge. When you make this cut, make it nice and deep. That means you may need to do it a couple of times. I roll that just because it's easier to control. Set that in position. I always want to make sure that this is level, so I use that stripe, that inlay on my bench to eyeball that. Get that nice and straight. Now, I've got to make a cut right here. So this is my waist. I'm going to identify it as such. I'm going to take my chisel and starting in the waist, carefully, I'm going to make a cut up against that line I made. Now what that creates is a little wall. So instead of me trying to get that saw started where I want, I've got two things I have to do. I have to get it started square and I have to make my cut plumb. If I can eliminate one of those, it's going to be a lot easier. So I'm going to bring that in until the teeth are right up against that line. Now you'll notice it's real easy to tell if I get off square. So while that's nice and square, I'm keeping a little bit of lateral pressure. I start my cut, and now I only have to think about making the plumb portion. I've got a nice square cut across the end. I also do this when I'm cutting a tenon. I'll come in, make my two gauge lines, and then take the time. In fact, let me grab a piece of wood and actually show you that. When I'm laying out a tenon, I'm using a tenon gauge, or mortise gauge we call it, even though it's most likely used for the tenon. I've got two lines, two parallel lines. And I've got to come in, again, I'm going to try to do this so that when I make this cut, I don't have to touch that tenon, it fits. Well, in order to make that a little bit easier, I'll take the time to come in here. Now, if it's a hardwood like that, it's actually advantageous to grab a narrower chisel so you're not having to push through so much material each time. Come in and make a little cut in the waist up against that gauge line. And that will provide you with that little trough that you can now set your saw in. It'll go right up against that shoulder. Get that started. Now, once you've got that line established, you only have to worry about getting the plumb cut. So half the problem is solved. in a real easy manner. So far we've been talking about back saws and a little bit about hand saws or panel saws, because if you're doing hand tool woodworking, you're most likely going to end up needing them. So you want to have a bench that supports your work at a good height. Mine's just a little bit below my knee. Be able to support the work so it doesn't vibrate. Same idea when it comes to a nice line. Follow your saw right up through, so you position your body so that that elbow is working right underneath your shoulder. Use your opposite hand. I use my thumb as a guide. I'm looking at my line. I typically start this one on the drawback. And the first little bit, you've got a little bit of control, meaning once your curve starts, your saw is going to follow that curve. But in the first little bit, there's enough slop in the curve that you can manipulate a little bit to try to get parallel to the line. Use all of the blade. Let the weight of the saw do the work. You don't need to push it excessively. And you can control it a little bit by twisting with your wrist. So if you're drifting off your line a little bit, over a long span, you can pull it back around just by twisting a little bit like this or a little bit like that, depending on which direction you need to go. We have our first beginning students. We get them doing this, and they go hard and fast. So just slow and steady. Again, thumb anchors the saw. Get it where you want it. Draw back. Do your little correcting right away. And that's a little bit of twisting the wrist one way or the other to get it following the line. Use all of the blade, or as much as you can. Let the weight of the saw do most of the work. Find a pace that you're comfortable with. Keep the sawdust off the line so you can see where you're going. I like to keep my board or my cut close to the edge of my bench so that it's well supported. Good technique, good tool, end up with a nice straight cut. Okay, I saved the best for the last. Maybe I should have started with this, but I didn't. I want to show you the advantage of a saw that is properly set. And just in case you don't know what that means, a saw has multiple teeth, obviously. Each tooth is bent. If the first one is bent to the right, the second one is bent to the left. Next one, right, left, all the way down. That enables the blade to get through the wood. If you didn't have that, the saw wouldn't get much more than 1/16 of an inch and it would get stuck. So the set creates a kerf that is wider than what we call the saw plate, this part right here. If the set is too wide, you get a very wide kerf and the saw wobbles. So I want to show you the advantage of a properly set saw. I've got a piece of 3/4 inch thick walnut. I'm going to make a cut about 1/2 inch in from the end. And I'm going to go down as deep as the saw will allow. Now, the first thing you're going to notice is that the saw, when set properly, will produce a very straight cut. So if you put a straight edge along that kerf, it's nice and straight. Well, I'm going to cut this off and show you the other advantage. Make this cut. One of the things that a straight cut makes is a flat surface. And if the set is not too great, it means very little raking on the side gives you a smooth surface. So a smooth, flat surface can create a very good joint. Now I'm going to join these two pieces. I'm going to flip it around, put them together. See how good that joint is? The side of your tail comes up against the side of your pin, and you get a really good glue joint. That is why the set needs to be minimal. If you have too much set, not only will it not produce a nice smooth surface, but the saw can wander because the kerf is allowed to slide side to side. So not only are you trying to follow the line, but you're also trying to steer the saw. Very difficult to do. You don't have to have a really expensive saw in order to take advantage of that. Here's one that was a hardware variety. I don't think it cost much more than $25. Teeth were really wide. Well, in order to fix it, all I had to do was take, I prefer to use a diamond plate, something that isn't easily destroyed, like a Waterstone would be. And relatively fine. This is a 1,000 grit side. I would set the saw right here like this, using my thumb pressure away from the teeth, and I would drag it like so, flip it over, and do the same thing. Same amount of pressure, same number of passes. Then I would over and I'd make a cut. And what I'm looking for is a nice narrow curve, but also I want to see straight. I don't want it to drift to the right or to the left. If it was drifting to the left, that means there's more set over here, allowing the saw to go into that easier or bigger area. So I would come over and I would just do one pass on that left side. Make another cut. If it's not corrected enough, I'll come and do another one. Keep doing that until you finally get that nice straight cut. So important in joinery in particular. The better the surface left from the saw, the sooner you're going to be able to join or put your joints together right from the saw. Saves so much time. When you have to come in and use the chisel to try to smooth and flatten that, it becomes a major pain and your success rate just drops dramatically. So get your saws set properly, or buy a saw that already has this done for you, so right out of the box it works beautifully. And I don't mind throwing in a plug. We make saws for that very reason. Hope this helps. Good luck with your sawing and your woodwork. If you enjoy my method of work and like my style of teaching, click on any one of these videos to help take your woodworking to the next level. I've always said better tools make the job so much easier. If you click on the plane and chisel icon below, it'll take you to our site and introduce you to all the tools that we actually manufacture right here in our shop. It'll also give you information on our in-person and online workshops.